Hello everybody, and now we're going to look at chapter 13, which is what happens when our competition we are looking at is in an oligopoly. And in an oligopoly, you're dealing with a situation where there are only a few companies that are competing. So we're going to start off looking at what is an oligopoly and how they work, the behavior behind them. We're going to look at three models of oligopolies, how oligopolies advertise, how efficient are they, and finally some game theory and strategic behavior. So an oligopoly is a few large producers. It's not as hard to enter as in a monopoly. You can set up shop, but it's generally very expensive, and there's only a few companies that are competing. So you can have what are called standardized or homogeneous oligopolies like steel or aluminum companies, or differentiated ones like car companies or electronics companies or breakfast cereals. There are only a few major car companies, but they are different. They make different products. They compete against each other. But there aren't 1,000 different car companies. And control over price is fairly limited because there's really not that many sellers. And rivals generally would respond in a way that would be detrimental to the company that changed the price. So firms generally use what's called strategic behavior or strategic pricing behavior, which a firm generally bases their decisions on actions and reactions of their rivals. So if a car company comes out with a new low-cost model, a lot of their major competitors will probably invent something similar within a short amount of time. This is an example of strategic behavior. Mutual interdependence exists when each firm's profit depends on its own pricing strategy and that of its rivals. And entry barriers are much more substantial here than monopolistic competition. So as a consequence, you don't have that many producers. You only have a few. And sometimes companies can get large from just internal growth, or they can grow through merging or taking over some of their competitors. So for something to be considered oligopolistic, you would need 40% or more to be of the market to be held by those top four firms. So the same logic we looked at before. So if more than 40% are held by four firms, you would say this is an oligopoly. What are some of the shortcomings here? Well, some of the shortcomings are the following. Localized markets. So if we're looking at localized markets, you may have a monopoly locally, but nationally you may have more competition. Inter-industry competition can occur when industries compete with each other, like let's say the glass and the plastic industry, or the aluminum can and the glass bottle industry. That would be an example there. So this competition is not reflected in their four-firm concentration ratios. And competition from things like imports from trade is not taken into account either. So when we look at the top four firms, we're looking at domestic firms. So this is a US focused class. We'd be looking at the United States, but whatever country we're interested in, we don't take into account foreign competitors. So you may have a dominant firm that is a foreign company or something like that, and we're not taking that into account. Or you may just simply have one dominant firm that's the overwhelming majority of the industry, and that's not necessarily reflected in the four-firm concentration ratio either. So if we look here, going from household, laundry equipment all the way down, these are examples of oligopolies. So cigarettes and beer and glass containers, these are all oligopolies. For instance, with beer, you might have seen on the news recently all those protests against Bud Light, and Modelo took over as the top spot. What's kind of ironic is Modelo is also an Anheuser-Busch InBev product, which is the company that owns Bud Light. The overwhelming majority of beer brands are owned by the top four firms. Household laundry equipment, so like washers and dryers, literally 100%. Refrigerators and freezers over 90%. Cigarettes and beer almost 90%, and going down the list. So these are all examples of oligopolies. Motor vehicles are 60%. Remember, it just needs to be 40% or more. Obviously, there are more car companies than companies that make beer, even though there's lots of brands of beer. Almost all of them are owned by large companies. But you would still say that is an oligopoly as well. And a lot of just various things here. So what about oligopoly behavior, we're going to look at some things. So game theory is a study of how people behave in strategic situations, and one thing is what is known as the prisoner's dilemma. It's something we're going to look at in a moment. And that's an example of mutual interdependence in game theory. Companies in an oligopoly can also collude. So colluding is cooperating with rivals for your own benefit. So if I collude with a fellow car company to make sure that we don't price our products below a certain amount, that would be an example of collusion to both our benefit. We'll be guaranteed to sell our products at a minimum amount and not engage in price wars. However, there can be incentives to cheat on your collusion agreement, because cheating can result in increased revenues to the cheater. So if I'm Chevy and I agree to collude with Ford and we're not going to sell any cars less than $25,000, and then I decide to come out with some new cheap model and price it at $20,000 and cheat on my agreement, I'm certainly going to get a benefit, at least in the short term, because Ford won't have anything comparably priced. Obviously, if I do that, then they will respond in kind. It's not going to last forever. But there is sometimes incentives to cheat on collusion agreements, depending on what they are. So if we look here, here's a two-firm oligopoly, and it's used to show the payoff from a combination of strategies. So you have two competitors and two strategies here. Each firm has two possible pricing strategies, and they're shown in the top margin and uptowns in the left margin, rare air up top. And each cell is this matrix showing one combination of a rare air and one combination of an uptown strategy. And we're going to look at the profit that can happen here. So each strategy has a payoff matrix. So if they both price high, if one price is low and one price is high, if they both price low, or if one price is low and the other price is high, here are the combinations here. So what's your greatest combined profit? And independent actions would stimulate a response. So your greatest combined profit, well, if they both price high, they're both going to make $12. If one price is high and the other price is low, however, the one pricing low will make more money. If they both price low, they'll both make $8. So these are the choices they run into. So assuming no collusion, the outcome of the game would be cell D with both parties using low price strategies. The reason being, if I price low, I know I'm going to make 15. And if my competitor prices high, I'll make 15. And they'll make 6. So I'm going to probably choose to price low and hope the other competitor prices high. However, if both are privy to this information, both are going to price low and wind up making $8. And in reality, it would have probably been better if they both priced high. So independently lowered prices and expectation of greater profit leads to the worst of the combined outcomes. So it causes inferior profits and eventually prices will rise. So this is without collusion. So eventually low outcomes make the firms return to higher prices, and now they'll both make $12. So this only works if your competitor does the opposite of you. Otherwise, if you both price low, you're leaving money on the table. So oligopolies can be tricky in regards to price strategies. That's why collusion gets very attractive. So we're going to look at what's called the kink demand curve. And the kink demand curve, there is what we use when we're looking at oligopolies. And we're going to look at 3 different models here. So there are 2 reasons there is not a single model to explain this market. Oligopolies encompass a great range and diversity of market structures. Decisions may depend on the actions of the companies or rivals, making it more difficult to explain the behaviors without several models. And we're going to look at them in the following slides. So the reason we have 3 models, oligopolies are diverse. They can take all different kinds of forms and markets, and complications of interdependence between the companies, such as collusion or price leadership or things like that. So first up, we're going to look at an oligopoly without collusion, similar to what we looked at before. So in this case, you're uncertain about your rivals' reactions. They might match our price changes, so if I raise or lower prices, they might match us, or they might do their own thing and ignore us. Because the firms don't collude, we don't know exactly what our competitors are going to do. So firms assume rivals will match any price reductions, but if we raise our price, there's no guarantee a rival would raise their price as well. They might keep their price low to steal our customers. So the strategy we would assume, if they're not colluding, match price reductions, because if we reduce prices and they don't, they're going to lose sales. And if we raise our price, they probably won't to steal some of our sales. There's no guarantee of this, but this is what we would assume to be true if there is no collusion. So our demand curve here is what we're looking at the following. Let's take a look. Let's bring it all up. So this is our kink demand curve. The slope of the non-collusive oligopolist demand and marginal revenue curves depend on whether its rivals match straight lines D1 and marginal revenue 1, or ignore straight lines D2 or marginal revenue 2, any price changes that we may initiate from our current price of P0. So if our rivals ignore our price increase, or if they decide to match our price increase. So if they ignore our price increase, their demand will be greater than if they choose to, if they ignore our price increase, they ignore our price increase, their demand will be greater than if they did. However, if they match our price decrease, their demand will go up as well. So once again, if they're not colluding, you would expect ignore increases, match decreases. And that's what we're looking at here. Remember, as price goes up, demand goes down. And as we look on the right side, in all likelihood, an oligopolist rivals will ignore a price increase but follow a price cut. And this causes the oligopolist demand curve to be kinked and the marginal revenue to have a vertical break or a gap. Because any shift in marginal cost between marginal cost 1 and marginal cost 2 is going to cut the dashed segment of the marginal revenue curve. No change in either price or output will result from such a shift. In other words, competitors and rivals strategize against each other. Consumers effectively have two partial demand curves, and each part has its own marginal revenue, resulting in a kink demand curve to the consumer. Price and output are optimized at that kink. So that's what happens when you have no collusion. So what are some of the criticisms of kink demand theory? Some of the criticisms are the following. So first off, the demand curve was created around the current price that was already being charged, but it never actually explained how the current price was determined. And you can argue this is similar to putting the cart before the horse. We have seen that prices are very rigid for reasons on the demand and cost side, but prices in oligopolies aren't as rigid as this model implies, so there's always the chance that changing prices could result in a price war. Once again, we're just looking in theory what we would expect to happen, when in reality, price wars, or I lower my price, my competitor lowers it more, I lower it more, and prices start plummeting, and this does happen, would completely throw this model off. So why do oligopolies tend to collude? And that's what we're going to look at right here. So by colluding, we mean the oligopolies have some sort of agreement that they won't raise their price without the other raising their price, or lower their price without the other, or minimum or maximum prices. These are all examples of collusion. So oligopolies tend to collude, and the model shows how they behave. So oligopolies are very conducive to collusion because there's only a few people. It's pretty easy to make agreements. And the tendency towards joint profit maximization. So if oligopoly firms face identical or highly similar demand and costs, they may collude to limit their output to set a single common price. And each firm acts as if it was a pure monopolist, setting an output at Q0 and charging price P0. And the price and output combination, and that's what we're going to bring up right now, and the price and output combination maximizes each oligopolist's profit. That's the green box right there, and the joint profit of the colluding firms. So in this case, they're going to act very similar to them being in a monopoly. Quantity 0 here, price 0 here, and as a consequence, they're setting a price significantly higher than their cost. They're making a good profit. and that is how this would work if they collude. And collusion works best when the good is homogeneous. So cars aren't as good because even though they're broadly similar, you might like Chevy more than Ford or something like that. But let's say we're talking about steel producers. There's only really a few of them, and raw steel is raw steel. It really doesn't matter who we get it from. As long as it meets certain specifications, it's going to do the exact same thing. We're going to melt it down and make a car or make some form of equipment or whatever you use steel for, or use it in construction. It doesn't matter if I bought it from company A or company B. So when the good is homogeneous or interchangeable, collusion is very, very common. So the major steel producers will probably collude with each other and wind up in the best possible situation for themselves. Note, for themselves, not necessarily for consumers, because just like a monopoly, you're going to wind up in a situation with higher prices and less quantity. So what's overt collusion? Overt collusion is when companies form what's called a cartel, and a cartel is a group of firms or companies that collude. They formally set a price and set output levels for their members. One of the best examples of a cartel is OPEC, that's the oil producing cartel, Organization of Petroleum Exporting States. That's what OPEC is, and that's major oil producers around the world. Excluding the United States. Collusion is illegal in the United States. It doesn't mean companies don't do it, but if you get caught, you can face penalties and charges. But OPEC, the oil cartel, that is an example of one of the largest in the world, and they're responsible for setting a lot of the oil prices. They restrict supply, and if they see the price going too low, they're going to cut production, and they have a lot of power over the oil industry. So here are a selection of OPEC nations here. So obstacles to collusion. Collusion's not always perfect. So there is demand and cost differences between members. Not every company has the exact same costs and the exact same demand. So it is difficult for all to charge the same price. Remember, the more homogeneous the product, the easier it is to collude. The more firms, the harder it is to maintain. If there's only 3 or 4 companies, it's much easier than if there's 40. There's always a tendency for members to cheat, and this erodes the power over time. So everybody is going to be tempted to cheat and go against the cartel for their own personal gain. And if a bunch of firms do this, the cartel loses power. Overall demand drops during recessions, and that's going to make cheating more attractive. If I have to price according to my cartel, but now there's a severe recession and my sales are plummeting, it's probably going to be more attractive for me to start cheating. Potential entry. New producers may enter the industry, and that by rule would increase supply and decrease prices. Remember, as a rule in any thing we're looking at economically, when you have more producers, supply goes up, price goes down, and there are legal obstacles. Remember, price collusion is illegal in the United States, and cartels are as well. So depending on what country we're looking at, it may be illegal to do this. It doesn't mean companies don't try, but you can get severely penalized if you do get caught. So what's an example of price leadership? And price leadership is an economic model where a dominant firm changes their price and then others follow the leader. So let's say we have an oligopoly where one firm is significantly larger than the rest, even though there's only a few. That leader is going to set a price, and then all of the smaller firms are going to follow along. And the leader generally will communicate price changes through advertising, speeches, articles, and one result is generally infrequent price changes because the leader is never certain the other firms will follow, and once again there are price wars. But when you do have a dominant firm, a lot of times smaller ones will fall in line and set their prices accordingly behind that dominant firm. So oligopolies generally, how do they compete or advertise? Well, think of cars. Cars are an oligopoly. Generally, they develop their products and heavily advertise them. Most major brands of cars are broadly similar. They all do very similar things. They're all pretty reliable these days. There's really no terrible cars anymore. So how does BMW make you want to buy one over a Mercedes, or Ford over Chevy, or Honda over Toyota? What do? They advertise. They advertise constantly. They sponsor things. They run ads, television commercials. They go to auto shows. They do all of that stuff. And obviously, there's more oligopolies than cars. Let's go back to my beer example before. There are infinite numbers of beer commercials. Think of how many just simply show up during the Super Bowl. Once again, all those products are broadly similar, but what do to compete against each other? They advertise and try to say why our product is better. We're lower calorie. Bud Light is lower calorie than Miller Lite or something like that. That's an example there. So they try to develop their product, come out with new products, and heavily advertise them. And generally, when you're dealing with oligopolies, because there's only a few competitors and they're usually highly profitable, they're usually very financially able to advertise their products. So advertising is generally more effective than changing your price, especially if you run an effective campaign. And anytime you see oligopolies, oftentimes that's what sets companies apart. So what are the And here are the largest advertisers, and I believe this data is as of 2021, so it's fairly recent. And generally, very large telecommunications companies and content providers top the list, along with some pharmaceutical companies and car companies, financial companies, and Amazon was the winner. $6.9 billion in advertising as of 2021. Comcast, AT&T are telecoms. Procter & Gamble make household products. Disney, content provider. Alphabet, technology company, that's Google's parent. Then Verizon, Charter, more telecommunications. Amex, credit cards, and General Motors is an automaker. They're the only automaker in this list, but automakers do advertise heavily. So these were the largest advertisers in the US. Note, not globally, this is US only data. So advertising is not all wonderful. So advertising can be manipulative, especially if the ads are misleading or making false claims. Generally, large companies don't do this, but companies certainly aren't always advertising things that are completely true. You can confuse your consumers. Consumers may pay high prices for a better advertised good because they don't know about the lower priced unadvertised version. And this is a trap that we've all fallen into. When ads are very successful, we generally equate the advertisement with the product, and as a consequence, we don't necessarily realize that there may be competitors that may be of a higher quality. They're just not advertised. We just might not know about them. So here's what we would argue the world's top 10 brands. This was, I believe, as of 2021 as well from a survey. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Samsung, Coca-Cola, Toyota, Mercedes, McDonald's, and Disney. Companies you have all heard of. And these are, as of 2021, the world's most valuable brand names in order. So big tech companies top the list, and then followed by Samsung, Coca-Cola, Toyota, and Mercedes are the only two car companies here. McDonald's and Disney, all giant brands, and this was based on the 4 criteria of their market share, world appeal across various age groups and nationalities, customer loyalty, and the ability to stretch the brand beyond the original product. So oligopolies are inefficient, very similar to monopolies. So productive efficiency is, remember, producing in the least costly way, and it means that your price is your minimum average total cost. Allocative efficiency is producing the right amount of output and its price is equal to marginal cost. Neither of this happens in oligopolies. Very similar to monopoly, more efficient than a monopoly, but still not efficient. Foreign competition has increased rivalry in oligopolistic industries. So think of the car industry. In the 1960s, pretty much the entire U.S. car industry was Ford, GM, and Chrysler. There were very, very few foreign cars. And then once Toyota and Honda and all of them caught on, that foreign competition certainly increased rivalry in an oligopolistic industry. Still oligopolistic, there isn't 100 car companies, but more choices, more efficiency. So if the oligopolist leader practices limit pricing, we may get lower prices. However, they may also not do this, and we may get higher prices than normal. Or not normal, but if there was normal competition. Oligopolies may also foster technological advance because the competition in the industry and the firms make so much money, they have the means to invest in new technologies. Think of all your huge tech companies, those are all oligopolies. They have billions of dollars. Microsoft, Apple, Google, all those companies have billions upon billions of dollars in cash. And what do they often do with it? You'll log on to the news and hear Microsoft just bought someone or Google just bought someone. Generally, they invest in all sorts of new technologies or simply hire people to invent them themselves. Every time Apple invents a new product or Google or Microsoft invents a new product, that's what they're doing there. So oligopolies aren't all negative, but we would say from an efficiency standpoint, they are inefficient. So, Nash equilibrium is a term. It was invented by John Forbes Nash. He was a very famous economist. If you've ever seen the movie A Beautiful Mind by Russell Crowe, that was him. He was a real person. And he came up with the economic theory of Nash equilibrium. And it's an outcome from which neither firm wants to deviate. It's described when rivals see their respective current strategy as the best possible choice given the other firm's strategy and the only outcome that is considered stable and will persist. If the outcome is not at the Nash equilibrium, then generally firms will continue to modify their strategies until they reach this equilibrium, stability, and the best outcome for themselves. So let's take a look here. So this is a single period positive sum game. We have two competitors, two price strategies, and each strategy has different payoffs. Independent actions stimulate a response. So we have Dramco and Chipco. So Chipco's strategy is its dominant strategy. It's international strategy. It's superior to anything else they do, whatever Dramco does. So if Chipco does the international strategy, they'll either make $11 or $20. Where if they use the national strategy, they'll either make 5 or 17. So in this case, the international strategy is better for them. Because regardless of whatever Dramco does, if Dramco goes international, they would make 11. Whereas if they chose the other way, they would only make 5. And if Dramco goes national, they'll make 20. Whereas if they chose the other way, they would only make 17. Dramco's strategy of international is also the best one for them, because whatever Chipco does, that's their best. If they go international, they'll either make 11 or 20, whereas if they choose the national strategy, they would only make 5 or 17. So since both choose the international strategy, what's our outcome? Well, our outcome is going to be this one right here, where both would make $11. And you could argue this is a Nash equilibrium because neither firm will really want to move away from this given the other firm's strategy. So if they switch to national, they're going to lose a lot of money, either one. So that's an example of Nash equilibrium. So what's a repeated game? Well, a repeated game is a game that recurs. So often firms continuously play the game. In this case, your optimal strategy for the firms is to cooperate and not compete as strongly as possible as long as their rivals do the same. So in this case, a lot of times if the game keeps reoccurring, we are going to cooperate and really not strongly compete. So think of broadly similar products: Coca-Cola and Pepsi, Boeing planes and Airbus planes, stuff at Walmart and Target, Nike and Adidas shoes. Generally, they're priced very similarly. Similar strategies for that reason. Generally, they're not massively competing. They have either price matching guarantees in the sense of Walmart and Target. They're priced incredibly similar in the sense of Nike or Adidas or Coke and Pepsi. Commercial airplanes are millions of dollars, but a Boeing and an Airbus are generally very similarly priced as well. Anytime you have very interchangeable products. So here's a repeated game with what is known as reciprocity. So in this example, what are we looking at? Well, we have two soda companies. Too Cool invents Cool Cola, and they advertise the hell out of it. And its rival Thirst Q maintains its normal budget, even though it could counter Too Cool with a large advertising budget of its own and drive the outcome from cell B to cell A. Thirst Q forgoes this $2 million of extra profit because they know they're going to be making their own new product called Quench It. And that's what we're looking at right here. Under yellow is what happened originally. So in the payoff matrix to the right, they introduce Quench It with a large budget. And Too Cool reciprocates what Thirst Q did originally by not matching the budget and allowing the outcome of the repeated game to be cell C. So in the first one, Too Cool is going to do better. In the second one, Thirst Q is going to do better. The profit of both Too Cool and Thirst Q therefore is larger over the two periods than if each had aggressively countered each other. So if each had aggressively countered each other, and I'm going to switch to green here, it would have been 10 and 10 and 11 and 11, both would have made a profit of 21. By doing what they chose to do here, we have 8 and 15, or 23, and we have 16 and 10, or 26. Both did better by not competing with each other. One ran the advertising blitz for their product, then the other ran the advertising blitz for their new product. And we see this all the time. Soda companies come out with new products often, and they run tons of commercials. And generally, you don't really see their competitor run a ton of commercials to counter them. until they come out with their own new product. So if Pepsi comes out with something new, they'll run a ton of commercials, and Coke will continue advertising, but they're not going to increase their advertising tremendously. And then when Coke comes out with a new product, they're going to do the same thing. So that's generally what happens. Now, what's a first mover advantage? So first mover advantage is being the first person to a market, and that's a very positive thing. So here's an example of a first mover advantage in this game in which strategies are pursued sequentially. The firm that moves first can take advantage of this situation, in which only a single firm can exist profitably in a market. So we suppose that Big Box moves first with its build strategy to achieve a $12 million profit. Huge Box will then find it'll lose money if it builds, because that will result in a $5 million loss. So in this case, if they both build, they're both going to lose money. However, if Big Box builds first, Huge Box knows they're going to lose $5 million. They're not going to do it. Because if they don't build, they won't lose anything. Nothing changes. So in this case, if you move first, you get the profit, and your competitor does not. That's a first mover advantage, and this does happen. So if these stores are broadly similar and there's only room in this area for one, if you're the first person to build it, you're going to get the benefit. And your competitor, even though if they choose to build can hurt you, you're both going to get hurt. They're not going to do something that they know is going to lose them money, even if it costs their competitor money as well. You have to think about your own company. And that brings us to our last word here. We argue the credit card industry, not argue, but it's true, is an oligopoly. It's very concentrated. There's really only a few companies that issue credit cards. Card issuing banks make money on unpaid balances, but they don't generally compete aggressively on interest rates. Most credit cards broadly have very similar interest rates. So what do? They engage in non-price competition, so things like rewards programs, perks, airport lounge access, and all the benefits you get with a card, or subscriptions to things, or free TSA pre-check. These are all the things credit card companies usually do. They're not really usually aggressively competing on their interest rates, because their interest rates are what make them almost all of their money on the credit cards. So that is just another example of an oligopoly and how they're competing with each other while all charging broadly the same rates. And that's going to take us to the end of the chapter.